Most people believe World War I was unavoidable, that the alliances, the rivalries, the build-up of weapons made it only a matter of time. But history tells a different story. It was not fate that pulled nations into war. It was a series of decisions, missteps, and moments where leaders could have chosen a different path, but didn't. The war didn't have to happen. It almost didn't. In the summer of 1914, Europe was tense but not at the edge of collapse. There were rival empires, yes, and nationalist movements, but leaders still believed diplomacy could keep the peace. The people of Europe weren't expecting war. Life was moving forward. And then, in Sarajevo, everything changed. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was visiting Bosnia with his wife Sophie. It was supposed to be a symbolic visit, calm, controlled, political, but it was anything but. A group of young men from Serbia had smuggled weapons across the border. They had a plan to assassinate the Archduke, but it was poorly organized. One man threw a grenade at his car. It missed. The convoy sped away. The rest of the day should have been uneventful, but fate had other plans. Later, the Archduke's car took a wrong turn. By sheer accident, it stalled in front of a cafe where one of the assassins, Gavrilo Princip, was standing. He had no idea the car would pass there, but suddenly, there it was. He stepped forward, raised his pistol and fired. Both the Archduke and his wife were killed instantly. Even then, war wasn't certain. Austria-Hungary was outraged, of course. But within their own government, voices debated what to do. Should they strike back? Demand justice? Or wait? In Berlin, Germany supported Austria but wasn't pushing for full-scale war. Kaiser Wilhelm II, reading Serbia's formal reply to Austria's harsh demands, was impressed. Serbia had accepted almost everything, offering cooperation, concessions, even compromise. Wilhelm believed this was enough. He said the crisis had been solved. He recommended a pause. He wanted peace talks. He thought war had been avoided. But behind the scenes, Austria had already decided. They wanted to punish Serbia. They saw the assassination as a chance to show strength, to remind the Balkans who held power. So they ignored the Kaiser's advice. They declared war. In Russia, Tsar Nicholas II was torn. He was close to Serbia and didn't want to abandon them. But he didn't want to provoke Germany either. He hoped that by mobilizing only parts of his army, he could pressure Austria without escalating things too far. At the same time, he wrote to the Kaiser, his cousin, begging for reason, pleading to find a peaceful solution. They exchanged personal telegrams, calling each other Nicky and Willie, trying to stop the storm they saw forming around them. But it was too late. Germany saw Russia's mobilization as a threat. Their military leaders insisted they must act fast. Their war plan called for a rapid invasion of France through Belgium to avoid fighting on two fronts. It was built on speed and surprise, not caution. Once Russia began moving troops, German generals demanded immediate action. Kaiser Wilhelm hesitated. He didn't want to invade Belgium. He feared Britain's reaction. He considered stopping the plan. But his generals refused. They said the army was already moving. Trains had been scheduled. Orders had been given. There was no going back. So Germany declared war on Russia, then on France. And soon, they invaded Belgium. That invasion gave Britain the excuse it needed to join. Britain had signed a treaty back in 1839 promising to protect Belgian neutrality. Some thought the treaty was symbolic, but others believed it was a matter of honour. Britain wasn't eager for war, but now it had a legal reason. On August 4th, 1914, they declared war on Germany. Just days earlier, this was unthinkable. Every country involved had someone in power trying to delay, negotiate, or de-escalate. No one expected total war. Many assumed the conflict would be short, sharp, over by Christmas. But instead, it became a nightmare. A war that dragged on for 4 years, tens of millions dead or wounded, entire empires gone, and it all began because the right people didn't act fast enough when they had the chance. There was no single villain, no unstoppable chain, just leaders unsure of themselves, listening too much to military advisors and not enough to reason. They chose pride over peace, momentum over pause. And once it started, the war fed itself. But for a brief window, just days before it began, it could have been stopped. The war wasn't born out of certainty, it was born out of hesitation. Once the war began, it wasn't welcomed with cheers everywhere. Many leaders and citizens alike were stunned. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Soldiers marched with flags, but diplomats stared at maps wondering how things had gone so wrong so quickly. And yet, even after the guns fired, peace still had a chance. In the early days of the war, there were still opportunities, missed again, for it all to stop before it became the nightmare it eventually was. When Germany invaded Belgium, they expected to pass through quickly, crush France, and turn back toward Russia. But the Belgian army resisted more fiercely than expected. French troops held the lines. The British sent soldiers across the Channel. The war didn't move fast. It dragged. Trenches were dug. Soldiers became stuck. It was no longer about a quick victory. It was about survival. But even then, the leaders behind the scenes knew this wasn't sustainable. By late 1914, they were already looking for ways out. Germany's top officers believed that a short victory was slipping from their hands. In Berlin, Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg began looking for ways to end the war before it destroyed the economy. He even drafted peace feelers to Russia. Meanwhile, in Russia, Tsar Nicholas was already overwhelmed. His army wasn't ready. His people were unprepared for the cost. There were discussions, quiet ones, about what peace might look like if things could just be frozen where they were. In Britain, voices in Parliament questioned why they were sending more troops into a conflict that seemed increasingly unclear. Some believed they had done enough by protecting Belgium. Maybe the rest of the war could be left to Europe. In France, President Poincaré was hearing complaints from generals about massive losses. Thousands of men were dying for tiny scraps of land. It didn't feel like glory. It felt like madness. Letters moved between capitals. Proposals were whispered. Austria considered accepting mediation from neutral countries like Sweden or Spain. The Pope even offered to help broker a ceasefire. But each time peace came close to being discussed, something went wrong. A new offensive would begin. A general would demand more men. Or worse, leaders would delay, afraid of appearing weak, afraid that their enemy would take advantage of a pause. No one wanted to be the first to blink. By Christmas of 1914, the war had reached a strange place. In many parts of the front, soldiers stopped fighting on their own. On Christmas Eve, British and German troops climbed out of the trenches and met in the middle. They shook hands, shared food, played games, sang songs. For a few hours, the war stopped. Not because of orders, but because ordinary people decided it didn't make sense anymore. When commanders heard what had happened, they were furious. Orders were issued banning any such truces in the future. Fraternization was declared dangerous. Generals feared that if soldiers realized they had more in common with the men across the line than with the men giving orders, the war might collapse from within. But that brief truce showed something else, that even in the heart of war, people still looked for peace when they could find it. In 1915, more chances came. Germany again considered offering a separate peace to Russia. France and Britain debated a negotiated settlement. The United States, still neutral, offered to act as a mediator. President Woodrow Wilson sent notes to the European powers asking for terms. But every time, national pride got in the way. No one wanted to admit the war had been a mistake, and so it dragged on. Behind the lines, people were beginning to question everything. Workers in Berlin and Petrograd went on strike. Food was scarce. Soldiers returned with horror stories. The glory faded fast. Civilians protested. Newspapers began asking hard questions. Why had peace talks failed? Why were young men dying by the thousands? The public hadn't been told the truth. And as the war stretched on, that truth became harder to ignore. In private, even leaders began to wonder if continuing was worth it. Some German officials believed the only way out was to break the British blockade and force talks. Others believed that if they waited, the Allies would collapse under the weight of their own exhaustion. In London, there were concerns about finances, about morale. Peace conferences were proposed again, but, as always, they were shelved. Too politically risky, too uncertain. And then came new weapons, new horrors. poison gas, massive artillery, flamethrowers. The idea of a quick, honourable end faded. Now it was about endurance. The war became less about victory and more about not losing. Leaders who had once hesitated were now trapped by their own decisions. Even those who wanted to stop couldn't find the way back. The machinery of war had taken over. The war that should never have started became the war no one could end. It started with a hiss. Not an explosion, not a gunshot, just a faint sound carried by the wind. On April 22, 1915, near the Belgian town of Ypres, soldiers standing in muddy trenches saw a strange greenish-yellow mist drifting toward them. There were no alarms. No one knew what it was. Some thought it was smoke. Then the coughing started. Choking, gasping, screaming followed. Panic spread, and in that moment, the world witnessed the first large-scale use of chemical warfare. Germany had released chlorine gas. Thousands of canisters hidden along their front lines, waiting for the wind to turn. When it did, the gas swept silently across no man's land and into the lungs of unsuspecting French and Algerian troops. It didn't just irritate, it burned from within. Chlorine gas reacts with moisture in the lungs, turning to acid. Breathing became agony. Men staggered, clutching their throats, eyes watering, collapsing where they stood. Entire units broke and ran. A 4-mile gap opened in the Allied line. But the Germans, possibly stunned by the effectiveness of their own weapon, hesitated and failed to capitalize on the breach. What made gas so terrifying was that it changed the nature of war itself. Until that moment, war was loud. Bullets, shells, screams. Now death came quietly. It floated on the breeze. It seeped through clothes, crept into lungs. You couldn't fight it. You could only hope the wind changed direction. This wasn't the first time chemical agents had been used, but it was the first time they truly worked. Earlier attempts at tear gas and irritants had failed due to weather or poor concentration. This time, there was no mistake. Germany had crossed a line, and the world noticed. The attack at Ypres caused international outrage. The use of poison gas violated the Hague Conventions, which explicitly banned chemical weapons. But in the trenches, legality meant little. The brutal logic of the war kicked in. If the enemy used gas, you had to respond with gas. So, the Allies began building their own programs. Britain, France, and later the United States raced to develop and deploy their own chemical weapons. Gas wasn't just a German tactic anymore, it became standard across the front. Chlorine was followed by phosgene, a deadlier, harder to detect gas. Then came mustard gas. Introduced by the Germans in 1917, it was different. It didn't kill immediately. It caused delayed symptoms. Searing blisters, blindness, slow suffocation. It lingered for days in the soil and on clothing. Even the air days later could still be deadly. Gas masks were quickly introduced, but they were far from perfect. They fogged up, restricted breathing, and were terrifying to wear. Soldiers lived in constant fear of surprise gas attacks, especially at night. Many kept soaked cloths ready, even urinating on them to use as emergency filters. It sounds desperate, but it saved lives. The ammonia helped neutralize chlorine, at least for a few seconds longer. Though chemical weapons caused fewer deaths compared to bullets or artillery, their psychological effect was far greater. The randomness, the helplessness, they broke morale in a way few other weapons could. Soldiers feared gas like nothing else. It wasn't just deadly, it was unpredictable. It didn't always kill. Sometimes it maimed, scarred, blinded. Sometimes it didn't even show symptoms until hours later. That unpredictability made it horrifying. Animals suffered too. Horses, pigeons, dogs, all vital to the war effort, were also exposed and died in large numbers. Civilians weren't always spared. Sometimes the gas drifted into nearby towns. Once released, it couldn't be controlled. The wind was both an ally and a traitor. One of the most unsettling parts of this history is how science played a central role. German chemist Fritz Haber was behind the first major gas attack. Ironically, he was also the man who invented the process for synthesizing ammonia, used to make fertilizer and feed millions. His work helped life and took it. He famously said, "In peace, a scientist belongs to the world, but in war, he belongs to his country." His wife Clara, also a chemist, was horrified by his role in the war. Just days after the Ypres attack, she took her own life. Soldiers who survived gas attacks often lived with long-term damage, scarred lungs, blindness, persistent cough, and fear of the next silent cloud. Gas turned the battlefield into a place where even breathing could be fatal. There were no safe moments, no safe spaces. By the end of the war, chemical weapons had become a horrifying standard, not because they were the most effective killers, but because of the terror they spread. Gas didn't just break bodies, it broke minds. And as the war raged on, the science behind chemical weapons only grew more advanced. The first major use of gas at Ypres wasn't just an attack, it was a threshold being crossed, a step into a darker kind of warfare. When the First World War finally ended, the relief was overwhelming. But among all the horrors people tried to forget, chemical warfare was the one that stuck. The memory of gas attacks, silent, invisible, cruel, haunted survivors long after the trenches were emptied. It wasn't just another weapon. It was a symbol of how far humanity was willing to go. A line had been crossed, and it couldn't be erased. As nations counted their dead and wounded, pressure grew to ensure such weapons were never used again. In 1925, the Geneva Protocol was signed, banning the use of chemical and biological weapons in war. It was seen as a major step forward. Countries around the world agreed. Poison gas had no place on the battlefield. But there was a catch. The treaty only banned use, not development or stockpiling. So while the world condemned gas in public, many governments quietly continued preparing for it. By the 1930s, chemical weapon programs were alive and well, just hidden from view. Laboratories in Britain, Germany, the Soviet Union, and the United States worked behind closed doors. Stockpiles grew, new gases were tested, equipment was refined. Some governments justified it as defensive, others didn't even bother. After all, if another war came, no one wanted to be caught unprepared. That next war arrived sooner than anyone hoped. In the build-up to World War II, millions of gas masks were issued to civilians. Schools held drills, posters warned people how to recognize a gas attack. In London, children walked to school carrying masks in cardboard boxes. Entire cities prepared for the air to become deadly again. But something strange happened. Despite the widespread fear and enormous stockpiles, chemical weapons were rarely used in World War II's combat zones. They remained in storage, waiting for a moment that never came. Historians still debate why. Some believe it was mutual fear. If one side used gas, the other would retaliate. Others argue it was strategic. Hitler himself had been gassed in World War I. Perhaps he knew too well how unpredictable and uncontrollable such weapons could be. Still, this didn't mean chemical warfare disappeared. It simply took new and darker forms. The Nazi regime, using the knowledge gained in gas development, engineered a new kind of horror. The industrialized murder of civilians. At Auschwitz and other concentration camps, Zyklon B, a cyanide-based pesticide, was used to kill millions in gas chambers. This wasn't warfare, it was genocide. The same science that had once created battlefield weapons was now turned fully against humanity. After the war, the world tried again to draw firm lines. New treaties were proposed. Public opinion was firmly against chemical weapons, yet the research didn't stop. Scientists who had developed wartime gas programs were recruited by new governments. The Cold War saw a quiet arms race, not just in bombs, but in nerve agents. These were unlike anything seen before. German scientists had developed compounds like sarin and tarbon, odorless, colourless, and far more lethal than chlorine or mustard gas. These weren't just tools of war, they were weapons of pure terror. Exposure could kill in seconds. The smallest drop on the skin could shut down the body's nervous system. These gases weren't used in open conflict, but they were produced, stored, and refined by both NATO and Soviet-aligned nations. In the decades that followed, the world saw chemical weapons return again, not on the massive battlefields of Europe, but in other places. During the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, Saddam Hussein's regime used mustard gas and nerve agents against Iranian troops, and even against Kurdish civilians. Entire villages were wiped out. Thousands died in agony. The footage shocked the world, but international response was slow and hesitant. Once again, politics outweighed justice. More recently, chemical weapons have reappeared in Syria's brutal civil war. Entire neighborhoods were choked by clouds of chlorine and sarin. Videos of gasping children filled news feeds. Global outrage followed, but so did denial, confusion, and deadlocked diplomacy. Investigations confirmed the use of banned agents, yet no one stopped it in time. The same old pattern: horror, condemnation, and silence. Even today, the threat hasn't gone away. Stockpiles still exist. Rogue actors have used chemical weapons for assassinations. In 2018, a former Russian spy was poisoned in a quiet English town using a rare nerve agent, just a tiny amount, enough to trigger evacuations, hospitalizations, and fear across the country. What makes chemical weapons so uniquely terrifying is how personal they are. Bombs destroy buildings, bullets rip through flesh, but gas invades the body. It makes the simple act of breathing a death sentence. It lingers, it infects, it turns the air, something essential and constant, into a silent killer. In the early 20th century, the Ottoman Empire was struggling to hold itself together. Once vast and powerful, it had become weakened by internal divisions, economic strain, and the rise of competing national identities within its borders. As the First World War broke out in 1914, the empire joined the Central Powers in hopes of reclaiming influence and regaining lost territories. But the war only deepened its challenges, and in the shadows of these global battles, a far more tragic and lesser-known chapter began to unfold, one that would alter the fate of an entire people. The Armenians were an ancient community within the empire, living primarily in the eastern provinces. They had their own language, traditions, and churches, and had coexisted with others for centuries. Yet tensions had grown in the decades leading up to the war. The decline of the Ottoman Empire created fear and uncertainty. Rising nationalism among different ethnic groups led to suspicion and distrust. In the eyes of the ruling authorities, the Armenians, many of whom were Christian, were increasingly seen as different, as potentially disloyal, especially as the empire faced enemies on multiple fronts. When the war began, some Armenian volunteers joined Russian forces who were fighting the Ottomans in the east. Though their numbers were small, their actions were used by the Ottoman leadership to justify widespread crackdowns on Armenian communities. What followed was a state-organized program that aimed to remove Armenians from their ancestral lands under the pretense of national security. In the spring of 1915, the empire initiated the mass arrest of Armenian leaders, intellectuals, and community figures in the capital, Constantinople. These arrests marked the beginning of a broader policy. Laws were passed permitting the relocation of civilians. Entire populations were forced to leave their homes. Families were separated. People were sent on long marches to unfamiliar regions under harsh conditions. Many did not survive the journey. Eyewitnesses at the time described scenes of great hardship. Foreign diplomats, missionaries, and even some Ottoman officials recorded what they saw. Trains filled with families, homes abandoned, towns emptied. Reports reached European capitals, and even American newspapers wrote about what was happening. Yet, the war overshadowed much of the world's attention. Relief efforts were launched, but little could be done to stop what was underway. The Ottoman government insisted it was acting out of military necessity, but historians, scholars, and legal experts have since documented that what occurred was systematic and deliberate. It wasn't just the relocation of a few communities. It was a policy aimed at erasing the presence of an entire people from their historical homeland. Churches were destroyed, cultural records disappeared, entire towns were renamed, survivors scattered across the globe, forming new communities in places like Lebanon, France, the United States, and beyond. The Armenian experience during World War I is today widely recognized by historians as a genocide, the intentional effort to remove a group of people based on their identity. The word itself didn't exist at the time. It was coined later, in part to describe what happened to the Armenians. Raphael Lemkin, the Polish Jewish lawyer who developed the term genocide, referred to their story when he began shaping international law to prevent such tragedies in the future. Yet for decades, the subject remained highly sensitive. In the years after the war, the new Turkish Republic, which succeeded the Ottoman Empire, distanced itself from these events. It focused on modernization and national unity, and often avoided discussion of what had taken place during the final years of the empire. For many survivors and their descendants, this silence added to the pain. Their history had not only been interrupted, it had been erased from textbooks, denied in official accounts, and left unspoken in diplomatic circles. Still, memory persisted. Armenians around the world passed down their stories of lost villages, broken communities, and the resilience it took to rebuild. Memorials were created, poems were written, and slowly the world began to listen. Scholars published volumes of research. Governments began recognizing what had happened. Some took decades to do so, others still hesitate. To remember the Armenian genocide is not to dwell on grief. It is to understand how quickly fear and suspicion can turn into state policy, how identity can be used to divide, and how the machinery of government, when unchecked, can be turned against its own people. The story of the Armenians during World War I is not just a regional history, it's a global lesson about the importance of memory, about the fragility of communities, and about the need to acknowledge the past, not to cast blame, but to prevent its repetition. After the war ended and the Ottoman Empire dissolved, a new political order began to take shape in the region. The Republic of Turkey emerged, determined to build a modern, secular nation free from the burdens of the past. But for the Armenian people, the wounds left behind did not heal easily. What they had endured was not just displacement, it was a loss of identity, community, and culture. Their world had changed forever, and they now faced the challenge of preserving their heritage in exile. Scattered across continents, Armenian survivors began to form new lives. Some settled in the Middle East in places like Syria and Lebanon. Others traveled to Europe, North America, and South America. In each new home, they carried fragments of the lives they had left behind: photographs, traditions, languages, and memories. Armenian churches, schools, and cultural centers began to appear in distant cities. These spaces became more than just places of worship or education. They were reminders of resilience and quiet defiance in the face of loss. Yet, while Armenian communities worked to rebuild, the wider world struggled to come to terms with what had happened. The term genocide still did not exist in legal language. Though many diplomats and observers during the war had documented the suffering of Armenians, their reports were often overshadowed by the global effort to recover from the war's devastation. There were trials in the early 1920s in Constantinople, where Ottoman officials were found responsible for organizing deportations and mass suffering. But those trials were short-lived and incomplete, eventually abandoned due to political instability. The Treaty of Sèvres, drafted in 1920, had promised justice and the possibility of a homeland for Armenians. But the treaty was never fully implemented. It was replaced by the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923, which made no mention of the Armenians or any form of accountability. For many survivors, this silence felt like a second loss, a quiet dismissal of their experience by the world community. As the decades passed, the issue of recognition became deeply political. The Turkish government, which had inherited the institutions of the former Ottoman state, rejected the term genocide. They acknowledged that many Armenians had suffered and died during the war, but insisted it was the result of civil conflict and hardship, not a planned campaign. This stance became official policy. Speaking openly about the events of 1915 inside Turkey could lead to legal consequences, and even now, open discussion remains sensitive. Outside of Turkey, however, recognition slowly grew. Armenian advocacy groups, scholars, and human rights organizations campaigned for public acknowledgement. They collected survivor testimonies, uncovered archival documents, and held memorial events. Over time, countries began to officially recognize the Armenian genocide, often through parliamentary resolutions or formal statements. France, Canada, Russia, and many others took that step. Others, including the United States, hesitated for years due to diplomatic concerns, especially regarding their relationship with Turkey, a key ally in the region. It wasn't until 2021 that a sitting US president officially used the term genocide to describe the Armenian experience during World War I. It was a moment long awaited by Armenian communities around the world, not for revenge, but for acknowledgement. Recognition wasn't about reopening old wounds, it was about affirming that what had happened mattered. For the descendants of survivors, memory has become an act of preservation. Oral histories are recorded, cultural traditions are passed down through music, food, and art. The Armenian genocide is taught not just as a national tragedy, but as a warning about what happens when fear overrides compassion and when difference is treated as danger. Today, Armenia remains a small country, bordered by powerful neighbours and shaped by a long, complex history, but its diaspora, spread across continents, continues to honour its roots. Every year on April 24th, Armenians around the world gather to remember. They light candles, walk in silent processions, and read the names of lost villages. It is a day of reflection, but also of unity. The recognition of the Armenian genocide remains a sensitive issue in international politics, yet it has never been solely a matter of law or diplomacy. It is about truth, about allowing a community to speak its history without fear of denial, and about ensuring that future generations understand how easily silence can become complicity. The story of the Armenians is not just about suffering, it is also about strength, the ability to survive, to rebuild, and to continue. Their legacy is not limited to what was lost, but also defined by what has been preserved: language, culture, memory. These are the quiet victories of a people who refuse to be erased. When people imagine war, they often picture roaring guns, charging soldiers, and chaotic battlefields. But for most men who served in World War I, the real enemy wasn't bullets or shells, it was disease. It was the cold, the mud, the hunger, and the unrelenting weight of the environment itself. For every soldier lost in battle, many more fell to conditions that had nothing to do with direct combat. The trenches didn't just hold enemies across the field, they became battlefields themselves, filled with invisible threats. From the moment men arrived at the front, they faced a daily war against nature. Trenches stretched for miles across Europe, carved deep into soil that turned to sludge with every rain. These trenches, often dug quickly and without proper drainage, filled with water, sometimes rising above the knees. Soldiers stood in soaked boots for days at a time, leading to a condition known as trench foot, painful, sometimes disabling, and hard to treat in the middle of war. The mud wasn't ordinary. In some places it was so thick it could pull men under. Equipment was lost, movement slowed, and exhaustion set in faster. Rats thrived in the trenches, growing large from feeding on leftover food, and worse, on the fallen. Lice were a constant torment, spreading from one soldier to the next, causing itching and infections. They laid eggs in clothing and bedding, making rest nearly impossible. And then there was the cold. Winter brought freezing temperatures to the Western Front. Soldiers didn't always have proper coats or dry socks. Fires were difficult to light without drawing attention. Frostbite was common. So was hypothermia. Many soldiers came home not with war wounds, but with missing toes and damaged nerves from months spent in the freezing wet. Food was another constant challenge. Meals were basic, repetitive, and often cold. Supplies didn't always make it to the front lines, especially during heavy shelling. Water could be scarce or contaminated. Dysentery, a severe intestinal infection, spread rapidly. With poor sanitation and limited medical supplies, even treatable illnesses became serious threats. Perhaps the most dangerous of all was the flu. In 1918, the world was hit by a pandemic that would come to be known as the Spanish flu. It moved through camps and trenches faster than any weapon. Soldiers, already weakened by cold, poor nutrition, and stress, were especially vulnerable. Entire units fell ill. Hospitals were overwhelmed. It's estimated that this flu outbreak killed more people than the war itself, including young, otherwise healthy men who had survived the front. Medical care, though improving, was still basic. Field hospitals struggled with the volume of patients. Antibiotics did not yet exist. Wounds could become infected quickly. Minor injuries sometimes led to serious complications. Recovery was slow, and many soldiers returned to duty before they had truly healed, increasing their risk of falling sick again. Psychological strain was just as damaging. Soldiers lived with constant stress, even when not under fire. The threat of shelling, the absence of comfort, and the loss of comrades wore down their mental health. Some broke under pressure, a condition then called shell shock, now understood as post-traumatic stress disorder. But treatment was limited. In some cases, men were seen as weak or disloyal simply for being unable to continue. Disease did not care about rank or bravery. It spread through close quarters, in the same way soldiers shared blankets or water bottles. Letters from the front often mentioned not only fear of the enemy, but exhaustion from fever, coughing fits, and the endless chill. Many soldiers feared sickness more than they feared gunfire. On some fronts, like in the Middle East and Africa, the environment posed even more intense threats. Malaria, typhoid, and heat stroke affected soldiers unfamiliar with local conditions. Sanitation was poor, and clean water was difficult to secure. Medical teams worked hard, but there was only so much they could do in such difficult terrain. Even after the war, many who returned home carried lasting effects, not just from wounds, but from the long months spent in unhealthy, stressful conditions. Chronic illness, respiratory issues, skin conditions, and psychological trauma shaped their post-war lives. Their suffering continued long after the fighting had ended. In many ways, the experience of war for the average soldier was less about moments of action and more about endurance. Enduring the cold, the hunger, the illness, the loss of routine and comfort, the endless waiting in flooded trenches, the background hum of sickness that could strike at any time. The story of World War I is often told through battles and dates, but in the quiet, damp spaces between the attacks, soldiers faced their greatest challenge, surviving the world around them. The environment itself became their longest and most persistent opponent. World War I didn't just end with an armistice, it ended with a reshaping of the world itself. Borders were erased and redrawn, empires that had ruled for centuries disappeared. New nations emerged, some with hope, others with deep instability. The world map, once familiar to the old powers of Europe, looked very different by the time the peace treaties were signed. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, once a vast and complex web of ethnic groups, cultures, and territories, simply ceased to exist. In its place rose a patchwork of new states: Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, later known as Yugoslavia. What had once been ruled under a single crown now became separate nations, some eager for independence, others struggling to define themselves amidst ethnic tension and economic hardship. The Ottoman Empire, long known as the sick man of Europe, finally fell apart. Much of its Arab territories were placed under the control of Britain and France, not as colonies, but under a new system called mandates. This led to the formation of Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Transjordan, and Palestine. The Middle East was redrawn not by its people, but by distant diplomats with maps and pens. Borders were drawn with little regard for tribal lines or religious identities, planting seeds of conflict that still echo today. In Eastern Europe, the Russian Empire had already collapsed from within, replaced by the Soviet Union after revolution and civil war. But the fall of the Tsars also allowed other nations to assert their independence. Poland re-emerged after more than a century of being carved up by its neighbours. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania declared independence along the Baltic coast. Finland separated from Russia, becoming its own nation. These states, new and hopeful, stood in a delicate position between the fading monarchies of Europe and the rising Soviet power to the east. Germany, defeated and isolated, lost significant territory. It gave up Alsace-Lorraine to France, lost land to the newly formed Poland, and saw its colonies abroad taken over by other powers. The Treaty of Versailles didn't just limit Germany's military, it changed its geography. Parts of what had been German-speaking areas were now in other nations, creating tensions that would linger for years. The city of Danzig became a free city under the League of Nations, separating East Prussia from the rest of Germany, creating resentment that would resurface in the next war. Africa also felt the changes, though its people had little say in them. Former German colonies such as Tanganyika, Cameroon and Southwest Africa were handed over to other colonial powers, mainly Britain and France, under mandate rule. The European powers did not end colonization, they merely reshuffled the pieces. Lines were drawn and resources divided, without consulting the people who lived there. These decisions would shape future independence movements across the continent. Asia, too, was impacted. Japan, having joined the Allies, gained territories in the Pacific and took over German holdings in China's Shandong province. This move, later solidified by the Treaty of Versailles, sparked anger and protest in China. The May 4th movement, a wave of student demonstrations, began in response. It was a turning point that led to the rise of modern Chinese nationalism and reshaped political thought in the region. Even the Pacific Ocean saw new divisions. German islands were handed to Japan and Australia. The global balance of power was shifting. The old colonial empires weren't just redrawing borders, they were preparing to hold on to influence in a changing world. Back in Europe, the map looked fractured. Many of the new nations formed from the collapse of empires had never existed as independent states. Czechoslovakia combined Czechs, Slovaks and other minorities under one flag. Yugoslavia united South Slavic groups, but internal divisions would persist. Poland was reborn but surrounded by powerful neighbours. These countries had new flags, new leaders, but many inherited old problems. The peacemakers, gathered in Paris in 1919, tried to shape a new global order. But their tools were diplomacy, ambition and guesswork. They hoped the new borders would bring peace. In reality, they created fragile states and unresolved disputes. In many regions, people found themselves on the wrong side of new lines. Minorities inside unfamiliar countries, new rulers, new languages, and shifting loyalties. In some places, the change brought opportunity. In others, it brought unrest. The League of Nations was formed as a symbol of this new world order, a promise of diplomacy and cooperation. But the League had no army, no real power to enforce peace. It relied on the goodwill of nations still recovering from war, and in time, its limitations would become clear. By the early 1920s, the world looked different, not just in borders, but in power, influence, and uncertainty. The redrawing of the map after World War I wasn't the end of an era, it was the beginning of decades of unrest, shifting alliances and fragile peace. As new nations rose, many old questions remained unanswered. The war had reshaped the globe, but it had not resolved the forces that caused the conflict to begin with. One of the most immediate effects of this redrawing was the rise of nationalism. New countries were created based on ethnic identity, but few were homogeneous. Borders drawn in peace conferences didn't always reflect the complex realities on the ground. In many cases, large minority populations found themselves living under new governments they didn't choose. Hungarians lived in Czechoslovakia. Germans lived in the newly formed Poland. Slavic populations were mixed across Yugoslavia. These arrangements, while intended to preserve peace, often created new tensions. For example, in Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland region was home to a significant German-speaking population. Though part of a new democratic state, many Sudeten Germans felt isolated, longing for reunification with Germany. This sentiment would later be exploited in the lead-up to World War II. Similarly, in Poland, newly drawn borders left many Ukrainians, Lithuanians, and Germans within its boundaries, setting the stage for future disputes. Even among allies, disagreements emerged. Italy, promised territorial gains during the war, did not receive everything it expected. The so-called mutilated victory left Italians feeling betrayed by the Allies. This dissatisfaction created fertile ground for radical political change, one of the many factors that contributed to the rise of authoritarianism in the interwar period. In the Middle East, the new map caused even deeper confusion. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, a secret deal between Britain and France during the war, divided the former Ottoman Arab lands into spheres of influence. But these new borders ignored tribal affiliations, cultural differences, and religious divisions. Iraq, for instance, combined Sunni Arabs, Shia Arabs, and Kurds into one state, despite their differing identities and histories. In Palestine, promises made to both Jews and Arabs during the war came into conflict, leading to long-term disputes that persist to this day. Colonial holdings were also affected. Though the European powers kept most of their empires intact, the war revealed their vulnerabilities. Colonized people across Africa and Asia had fought and died in a European war, yet they returned to find the same unequal systems in place. This disillusionment inspired early independence movements. In India, for example, veterans who had served in the British Army began to question the fairness of continued colonial rule. The seeds of decolonization had been planted, not through treaties, but through lived experience. China, too, felt the sting of global politics. Despite being on the side of the Allies, China was not treated as an equal power at the Versailles Conference. Japan was awarded former German territories in Shandong, sparking nationwide protests known as the May 4th movement. These protests would eventually lead to the growth of Chinese nationalism, the rise of competing political movements, and a long struggle for self-determination. Meanwhile, the global economy, already strained by years of war, had to absorb the shock of newly drawn borders and trade routes. Countries that had once been part of large empires were now small and independent, with limited infrastructure and new currencies. Trade barriers rose, economic cooperation faltered. These challenges were felt most acutely in Central and Eastern Europe, where inflation, unemployment, and poverty created social unrest. The reshaped world needed a new kind of diplomacy. The League of Nations was created with that hope. It was meant to prevent future wars, provide a forum for dispute resolution, and protect minority rights. But its authority was limited. It had no army. Major powers like the United States never joined. And when early challenges arose, in Ethiopia, in Manchuria, the League struggled to respond. The idea of global cooperation was powerful, but the tools to enforce it were weak. Still, not all changes were negative. The redrawing of borders allowed some nations to find their voice for the first time in centuries. Countries like Poland and the Baltic states embraced independence with optimism. Czechoslovakia became one of the region's most successful democracies, at least for a time. These nations built new institutions, schools, and identities. Their people celebrated freedom, even as they navigated the uncertainty of self-governance. Yet when we hear about World War I or World War II, the spotlight is usually on the soldiers from Europe or the United States. But hidden in the shadows of that history are millions of men from colonies, India, Africa, the Caribbean, Southeast Asia, who were called upon to fight for empires that didn't fully recognize them. They weren't just helpers or background figures. These men made up a major part of the fighting force. They dug trenches, fought in combat, carried supplies, and risked their lives in some of the deadliest battles. Yet, when peace returned, they were left behind in memory. Let's start with India, part of the British Empire. In World War I alone, over 1.5 million Indian soldiers served across Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. In freezing cold trenches in Belgium and in the deserts of Mesopotamia, they stood shoulder to shoulder with British troops. Some volunteered, others were recruited. Many never returned. In World War II, even more were called up. Over 2.5 million Indians served, forming the largest volunteer army in history. Indian soldiers fought the Japanese in Burma, the Nazis in North Africa, and helped secure Allied victories in crucial campaigns. Yet after the war, their stories faded from the mainstream. Their efforts were not always celebrated like those of British or American troops. Across Africa, the same silence followed sacrifice. Soldiers from Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana, and Sudan joined the British and French armies. The King's African Rifles and the West African Frontier Force saw action in both world wars. They fought in jungles and deserts, marched for miles without proper boots, and were often paid less than their white counterparts. Still, they remained loyal. The French colonies too, especially in North and West Africa, sent hundreds of thousands to fight. These included the tirailleurs sénégalais, infantrymen from Senegal, Mali and other regions. They were sent to the front lines in France and used in dangerous offensives. After the war, they were sometimes excluded from pensions or even denied proper burials. A heartbreaking example of this injustice is the Thiaroye massacre in 1944. African soldiers, having returned from Europe, demanded equal pay. Instead of listening, French troops opened fire on them in Senegal. Many were killed for simply asking for fairness. It wasn't just men. Some colonial women served as nurses, radio operators and spies. One such figure was Noor Inayat Khan, an Indian woman who worked as a British spy in Nazi-occupied France. She was captured and executed, yet her name is known to very few. So why were these troops forgotten? One reason is that colonial powers didn't want to give too much attention to their subjects' contributions. Highlighting their bravery might also highlight their right to freedom, equality, and self-rule. Instead of medals and memorials, many got silence. Some weren't even allowed in victory parades. Others got reduced pensions or were sent home quietly with no recognition. Many soldiers didn't receive proper graves. Their names weren't carved in stone. Their stories didn't make it into the textbooks. Today, efforts are being made to set the record straight. Historians are uncovering letters, medals, and military records to bring these forgotten heroes back into the story. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission has begun identifying unmarked graves and correcting past neglect. In 2021, the British government acknowledged this injustice in a report, calling it a profound historical wrong. But the truth is, remembrance came late, and it still isn't complete. These soldiers didn't fight for glory. Many fought because they had no choice. But once in battle, they showed bravery equal to any. They endured poor treatment, racism, and unequal pay. And still, they carried on. They were heroes. They were forgotten. It's time we remember them not as footnotes, but as an essential part of history. Their blood helped shape the world we live in today. They deserve to be known. They deserve to be honoured. And above all, they deserve to be remembered. When we talk about war, our minds often drift to soldiers, generals, weapons, and battlefields. But there's a side of war history that's often overlooked. The animals, horses, pigeons, dogs, elephants, camels, and even glowworms played vital roles in conflicts across the world. They served silently, loyally, and often heroically alongside human soldiers. Their contribution wasn't small, it was essential. Let's start with horses, the original warriors of the battlefield. For centuries, horses were at the centre of warfare. In World War I alone, over 8 million horses were used by all sides combined. They were primarily tasked with transporting troops, pulling artillery, and carrying supplies. The harsh conditions of the trenches, barbed wire, and machine guns made cavalry charges less effective over time, but horses still remained crucial for movement across rough terrain where machines failed. One such hero was Warrior, a horse ridden by General Jack Seeley. Warrior survived multiple battles, shellfire, and chaos. He became known as the horse the Germans couldn't kill. His story became legendary, and he was even awarded medals posthumously long after the war ended. Then there were the dogs. Loyal, intelligent, and brave. Dogs served in both world wars as messengers, sentries, mine detectors, and companions to soldiers in the trenches. One of the most famous war dogs was Stubby, an American dog who served in World War I. He was smuggled to the front lines by a soldier, and Stubby quickly proved his worth. He could sniff out gas attacks before they happened, locate wounded soldiers, and even capture a German spy by biting him and holding him down until help arrived. Stubby was promoted to sergeant and became a national hero after the war. Messenger pigeons may seem like an odd addition to the list, but they were vital. During World War I and II, radio communication was often unreliable. In those moments, pigeons carried life-saving messages across enemy lines. One pigeon, Cher Ami, flew over 25 miles through enemy fire in 1918, delivering a message that saved nearly 200 soldiers. She had been shot, blinded in one eye, and had a leg hanging by a thread, but still completed her mission. For her bravery, Cher Ami was awarded the French Croix de Guerre. Elephants were also used, particularly in Asia. In regions like Burma and India, elephants were employed to move heavy equipment, logs, and even build roads. Their strength and intelligence made them valuable in terrains where no vehicle could go. These majestic animals often worked under intense shelling and dangerous conditions, proving to be calm and reliable companions in chaos. Camels served in desert warfare. In World War I, the British formed the Imperial Camel Corps, which operated in the Middle East. Camels could survive without water for long periods and travel long distances over sand, making them ideal for patrol and transport. Soldiers found them more reliable than horses in desert combat zones. Then there's the lesser-known story of glowworms in World War I. Trenches were dark, and lighting a match could give away your position to the enemy. Soldiers began collecting glowworms in jars to create soft natural light that wouldn't alert snipers. These tiny insects helped soldiers read maps and letters without risking their lives. It's a small thing, but it meant the world in a war where even a flicker of light could spell death. Let's not forget mules and donkeys, the quiet backbone of logistics. They carried ammunition, water, food, and supplies over rugged terrain. In mountainous and narrow paths where vehicles couldn't go, mules saved lives. Simpson and his donkey became legends during the Gallipoli campaign in World War I. An Australian medic named John Simpson used his donkey to ferry wounded soldiers to safety while under fire. He continued this selfless act for weeks until he was killed in action. The donkey kept going even after Simpson was gone. Animals weren't just used for labour, they were companions. Soldiers formed deep bonds with the animals who shared their hardships. Cats were often kept on ships and in trenches to control rats, but they also brought comfort. Soldiers wrote letters home about their cats, named them, and mourned them when they were gone. In war, where every day brought death and despair, animals were a source of sanity and solace. Sadly, the cost to these animals was enormous. Millions died in service, often with no recognition. They suffered from hunger, cold, injury, and stress, just like the humans they served beside, but their loyalty never wavered. They didn't understand politics, but they followed commands. They didn't know what war was, but they gave everything for the soldiers they trusted. In December 1914, the war was just a few months old, but already it had lost its illusions. Across Europe, men who had marched off to glory now lived in trenches. The Western Front stretched like a scar through France and Belgium, muddy, cold, and cruel. Rain had turned the soil into sludge, rats ran freely, and death lingered even when the guns paused. There was no end in sight, only frostbite, silence, and the constant presence of fear. But as Christmas approached, something unexpected began to unfold, something no general could have ordered, and no government could have predicted. It started with singing. On Christmas Eve, in several places along the front, German soldiers began to sing from their trenches. Carols like Stille Nacht floated into the night. Their voices rose through the still frozen air and drifted across no man's land. British soldiers huddled on the other side listened, confused, then intrigued. And then they replied. Songs were exchanged, not bullets. Laughter replaced orders. The snow-covered battlefield became, for one night, something very different. Small lights appeared on the German side, candles, balanced on makeshift Christmas trees or helmets. In places like Ypres, Artois, and the Somme, the soldiers on both sides did something extraordinary. They stepped out of the trenches. It wasn't a mass event along the entire front, but in scattered pockets, men climbed out unarmed and walked toward their enemies. No gunfire, no shouting, just cautious steps, raised hands, and curiosity. Soon, they were standing face to face, British and German soldiers shaking hands, exchanging greetings in broken language, and sharing gifts from home. Cigarettes, chocolates, tinned meat, buttons, scarves. Some posed for photographs together, others shared family stories. For a brief moment, the lines drawn by governments and generals faded away, and in at least one sector, they played football. It wasn't an organised match, just a ball kicked around in no man's land. Boots for goalposts, mud for the pitch. Laughter echoed through the cold air. It didn't matter who won. What mattered was that the game was played at all, by people who had been shooting at each other days before. Some soldiers took the chance to bury the fallen. The dead, who had lain between the trenches for weeks, were finally given rest. Both sides worked together to dig graves. In those shared moments, men looked into the eyes of their so-called enemies and saw someone not so different from themselves. News of the truce spread quickly, first by word of mouth, then in letters sent home. One British soldier wrote, "We are having the most extraordinary Christmas Day imaginable, a sort of unarranged and unofficial armistice." Another described a German offering him a sausage in exchange for a cigarette. The tone in these letters was one of awe, not just at the peace, but at the simple, profound humanity of it. But not everyone approved. Military high commands were uneasy. Some generals saw the truce as a threat to discipline. Orders were quickly issued to prevent further fraternization. Barbed wire was reinforced. Patrols were increased. Soldiers were warned that kindness could lead to court-martial. In many places, officers refused to allow any informal ceasefire, and by the time Christmas passed, the guns resumed. The war continued, darker and bloodier than before. The Christmas truce of 1914 didn't change the outcome of the war. It didn't stop the suffering or rewrite the maps, but it did something else. It reminded the world that beneath the helmets and coats and rifles, soldiers were still human. They were young men who missed home, who longed for warmth and peace, who, for one brief moment, refused to see each other as enemies. This act of unscripted peace became one of the most poignant and enduring symbols of World War I. It was spontaneous, sincere, and deeply human. It proved that war is not inevitable, that even in the middle of destruction, people can choose empathy. The story has been told in books and songs, monuments have been built, and every Christmas across Europe and beyond, the memory of that silent night lingers. It reminds us that history is not just about battles and treaties. It's also about what happens when ordinary people choose something extraordinary. In a war that was supposed to end all wars, where hope was buried under mud and wire, a group of soldiers proved that even the smallest light can shine in the darkest of places. For just one night, peace was not a dream, it was real.